In this video, I will introduce you to toy regulations in the UK. Primarily, I will focus on the Toy Safety Regulations 2011. Right, so before we get started, I just want to mention that this video serves as a broad introduction. I will not cover every single requirement that could potentially apply to toys in the UK. And I also want to mention that this video only covers requirements in Great Britain, meaning England, Wales, and Scotland, so not Northern Ireland. Now, as I mentioned, I will primarily dedicate this video to the Toy Safety Regulations 2011, which covers toys for the age groups newborns up to 14-year-olds, and essentially anything with play value. And then we also got UK REACH, which sets substance restrictions in all consumer products sold in the UK, including toys. First, let's break down the process under the Toys Safety Regulations. So the first thing we need to do is we need to confirm the regulations that apply. Let's say we've already done so, because as I mentioned, we already know that the Toy Safety Regulations 2011 applies to toys. And then we have to proceed and identify the designated standards, arrange lab testing, and also determine the conformity assessment procedure. This is phase one. The second thing we need to do is to create label files, UKCA marking, traceability, and also warning and instructions. And finally, we've got documentation. And it might seem overwhelming. Yes, it can be fairly complex, but I will do my very best to explain this in practical terms as we proceed in the video. So I will begin right here with designated standards. So the first thing you need to do is to identify the designated standards under the toy safety regulations that apply to your product. And generally, this means you will be looking at the list of EN 71 parts. The first three, or the very first one, which covers mechanical and physical properties, that refers to small parts or parts that could potentially break apart, could be a choking risk, for example. That's covered under EN 71-1. And in order to comply, you need to access this standard. You simply need to make sure that your product is designed to comply, that it simply doesn't, let's say, it doesn't have inherent design risks that could potentially result in injury or choking or something like that. So that's what EN 71-1 is about. The second one is for flammability. A third, we have migration of certain elements. These are essentially chemical restrictions specific to toys. And why I mentioned these three is because they apply essentially to all toys sold in the UK. And then we also have a list of other EN 71 parts that apply to specific types. That could be trampolines, electronic toys, finger paints, and so on. But these are only relevant if you sell a product that falls under one of these. Now keep in mind that your product is likely covered by more than one. As I actually stated, it's very often the case that part 1, 2, and 3 applies, and maybe one of these are listed below. And verifying compliance also means that you will need to submit the product for lab testing. So you will need to go to, say, a company like Intertech or SGS or TV Rhineland, and they will then issue a test report that verifies that your product is actually compliant with these. Right, let's move on and look at labeling requirements. So what you see down here is what we call traceability. So the toy must come with type, batch, serial, or model number. Usually what this means is that you need a product name, you need an article number or a SKU, and also a batch number, so the specific batch can be traced in case of a recall. B, you need a manufacturer's name, and that could be the brand owner. That's often the case anyway. So not necessarily the factory, just to be clear, and a single address at which the manufacturer can be contacted. So product information, your company name, and also the address. And this should be placed on the toy. If this is not possible, you apply it to the packaging or a user instruction booklet. Then we also have the instructions. So this is explained in regulations 20, a few different conditions, but in short, when necessary, when it's necessary, by, let's say, the nature of the product. You need to provide complementary instructions for the installation, for the use, and so on. Now, keep in mind that these instructions cannot in any way act as a substitute for complying with the safety standards mentioned. This is only a complement to the fact that your product is already safe. Okay, just to be clear. Now, these instructions could potentially be printed on a product, could also be affixed to the packaging, or in many cases to as user instructions in a little booklet. So the second part of labeling requirements. And finally, we have product specific, or let's say risk specific labeling requirements under Schedule 5. This is just a screenshot. There's actually a lot more text if you go to Schedule 5. But in short, there are specific requirements that apply, say, depending on the age group. So if you're selling a type of toy that's not appropriate for children under, say, 3 years, because it may contain small parts or something like that, and you would need to provide this symbol you can see right here. I'm sure you've already seen this. Now, as you can see here in point 2, they mention activity toys. And this is just an example of many product-specific warning requirements. And as you can see here, it states that activity toys must bear the following warning only for domestic use. And again, the list goes on. So this is not exhaustive. These are just two examples. So anyway, go to Schedule 5 and see if your toy product is on the list, and then you have to apply. Then you have to apply one of these mandatory warnings. Other than that, you also need a UKCA mark. So UKCA mark indicates, well, in this case, that the product is compliant with the Toy Safety Regulations 2011. But you also have, since, 2024 at least, the option to apply the CE mark. And that's something that the UK government opted for in order to make it easy for companies to sell, well, both in the UK and the EU, which is much appreciated. Then we have documentation. So I hope I'm not moving too fast, but you can always pause this video if you want. And first, we have the Declaration of Conformity. The Declaration of Conformity is essentially a self-issued document. It's usually a 1 page or maybe 2 pages. List of statements, really. And you can find the details under Schedule 3. Anyway, you need to provide unique identification of the toys, and that would likely be, again, what you put on the label: product name, batch, SKU, article number, and so on. Name and address of the manufacturer. That's likely your company if you design a toy, if you apply the brand. You need to have a statement under point 3. Object of the declaration, you need to have, well, provide additional information about the toy. Not really sure why they don't merge that on the point 1, but anyway, you could upload an image or something like that. That makes it easier to trace it. You need to, under point 5, you need to specify the different regulations that apply. That could be more than one. I mean, we know for sure that if you're selling a toy, you would definitely list the Toy Safety Regulations 2011. But if you sell an electronic toy, you might have a number of different regulations that you will also have to add in that case. So it could be more than one. But at the very least, under point 5, you will list Toy Safety Regulations 2011. Right, point 6, then we come back to the designated standards, EN 71-1, 2, 3, and so on. So you have to list the ones. You have to list the ones that you claim your product to be compliant with, then also that can be backed up by test reports. Declaration of conformity alone is not really worth anything unless you can actually back it up with test reports. And that's also what the authorities will expect if they will actually, if your product will be subject to a review. And if you have involved a notified body, which is likely not the case, then they also need to be specified. And finally, under point 8, you sign and specify the place and date, and name, function, and signature. And then you have to store it for 10 years. You have to stop selling the product even. It's quite a long-term commitment. Then we also have the technical documentation, and it's essentially an extended version of DOC, if I can put it that way, but you need to provide technical information, really. You need to provide information about the materials, the bill of materials, component lists, the conformity assessment procedure used, a copy of the declaration of conformity, address, manufacturer, which not necessarily your company address. If you import it from, say, China or Vietnam or something like that, you need to provide copies of the test reports. So that's really where it's grounded, this requirement. So you simply cannot get away without lab testing. You need to have lab testing as part of the technical documentation. That's a second set of documents. And finally is the user instructions again, actually. And the reason I mentioned this again, I did mention these under labeling requirements in the previous segment of this video, is that user instructions could both be applied, it could be applied to the packaging, but as you can see here under 7C, also instructions that accompany the toy, like a printed booklet, or maybe a combination of the two. So as such, user instructions or safety or precautions could also be applied to user instructions, which is very often the case. And this is the same situation for the product specific warnings, like the age groups or the one for activity toys, or the many other warnings that you can find under Schedule 5 could also be applied to documentation. Right, so that's everything I have to say about the toy safety regulations 2011. And finally, we have the UK version of REACH. Now, REACH is not specific to toys, but it does apply to consumer products. And what REACH does is that it sets restrictions. It sets limits on substances like phthalates, including DHP, heavy metals like lead, cadmium, mercury, and so on. And in short, if material used to make the toy contains any of these substances, and again, it's not just these four, the list is it's very long if you look on Annex 17, then you cannot sell the product, and you cannot sell it in the UK. So verifying compliance again requires third-party lab testing.